What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
You ever notice how silence isn't always quiet? Sometimes it screams. For me, it sounded like the soft click of a phone camera snapping a picture I'd never see, the one I was barely in and later, inevitably cropped out of. They always had their reasons, always something innocent, something you couldn't argue with without sounding paranoid or needy. Oh, the frame just looked better that way. You were a little blurry in that one. I didn't even realize you were cut off. The excuses evolved over time, got smoother, more polished, like they'd rehearsed them. But the message was the same: we don't want you here, not really. And last Christmas, they didn't even bother with the excuses. They just didn't invite me at all. It started small, almost unnoticeable. I was maybe 22 the first time I saw it. A photo from Thanksgiving, everyone huddled around the turkey like a Norman Rockwell painting, all warm smiles and elbows touching, and there I was, barely visible on the edge. My body was in it, half my face too, but cropped out in the version they posted. The family Christmas card that year didn't have me. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't a kid anymore. I didn't need to be on some postcard sent to Aunt Patty and her 10 cats in Boca Raton. I had my own apartment, my own life. But still, it stung. And then it kept happening. Year after year, family group texts lit up in November with planning. What night works for everyone? Don't forget the secret Santa limit is $50. I would reply, ask questions, offer to host, only to be ghosted or politely redirected. My suggestions were always great ideas that somehow never made the final cut. Then came the pictures. Every year, someone would post a glossy, well-lit photo on Facebook, the whole family together, standing by the fireplace at my mom's house, holding mugs of hot cocoa or awkwardly clutching wrapped gifts. I started scrolling with dread, scanning for my own face, hoping maybe this time I'd find myself tucked into a corner, even if my eyes were closed or my hair was a mess. But I was never in them. They didn't even try anymore. My brother, Jake, always had some new excuse for why I wasn't told about the party. We thought you were out of town. You said last year you didn't want to come. It was last minute. Lies, every one of them, and lazy ones at that. I never said I didn't want to come. I never missed a holiday until they stopped including me. And you know what's worse than being excluded? Being erased. Quietly, surgically removed from the memory of it all, like you never existed there in the first place. Like your laugh didn't echo through those same rooms for 20-something years. Like your presence was always optional, and now just inconvenient. This past year, I didn't even bother asking what the plan was. I'd learned my lesson. I made peace with the fact that I'd spend Christmas Eve alone, maybe binge-watch bad movies and pretend it didn't bother me. But then, on Christmas morning, I made the mistake of opening Facebook. My cousin Heather had posted a photo of the family at Grandma's house, lined up in the same damn spot we'd stood in every year since I was 5. The fireplace. The stockings. The cheap but familiar garland from Dollar Tree. And there they were, my mom, Jake and his wife, Heather, my aunts, uncles, even that weird neighbor guy who always brings wine no one drinks. Everyone was there. Everyone but me. And that's when I saw it. The photo looked nearly identical to last year's. Same angle, same lighting, even some of the same outfits. But something felt off. I pulled up the one from last year and put it side by side. And then it hit me like a gut punch. I had been in the original version. Last year, I'd stood on the far left, next to the plant Grandma always forgets to water. But in this year's photo, they'd filled that spot with a side table and a poinsettia. It was like they hadn't just forgotten me. They designed the picture without me. Deliberately. I sat there, just staring at that screen, heart pounding in this weird mix of sadness and rage. I wasn't sad they forgot to include me. I was angry because it felt like they wanted me gone. Not just physically, but from the narrative. From the history. From the damn story of our family. And that's when I realized this wasn't an oversight. This was a pattern. A system. A quiet erasure, year after year, photo by photo, moment by moment, until all that remained was a vague mention in passing. Remember when Melissa used to come around? Oh yeah, she was sensitive. Always dramatic. Sensitive. That word. God, I hated it. It was their way of making me the problem. Their way of saying you overreacted. You made things uncomfortable. You didn't smile the right way. You didn't laugh at the right moments. You didn't let things slide when they made those little jabs about my weight, my job, my lack of a man, as my Aunt Carla so charmingly put it one Easter. They always said it with a smirk, like it was a joke, like I was supposed to be in on it. But jokes like that? They're only funny when everyone laughs. And I wasn't. So that morning, staring at that photo, I didn't cry. I didn't text anyone. I didn't beg to be included or ask why I was left out. I just sat there, sipping cold coffee, thinking, if they didn't want me in their perfect little pictures, fine. But this year, I'd make damn sure they couldn't ignore me. I'd make myself unforgettable. And not in the way they expected. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt so invisible to your own family that you started to wonder if you really were the problem? Like maybe the way they treated you wasn't mean, it was just a reflection of who you were? Have you ever been erased not with cruelty, but with politeness, and somehow that hurt worse? Because that's the thing. My family didn't scream at me or disown me or block my number. They just slowly, casually made me disappear. But this year, I'd reappear. Big, bold, and inescapable. Right outside Grandma's front window. Because if they wouldn't include me in the family photo, I'd become the one thing they couldn't crop out. The background. The scenery. The goddamn billboard. And that's exactly where this story begins. There's something oddly heavy about humiliation that comes from your own blood, not the loud, explosive kind that turns into screaming matches at dinner tables or dramatic exits from living rooms filled with tension, but the quieter version. The kind that builds over years of half-glances, politely ignored comments, and carefully orchestrated absences where your presence would have disrupted the illusion of a perfectly happy family. That's what I carried with me into the days following that Facebook photo, a weight not heavy like grief or loss, but more like rust on the bones, subtle, persistent, and impossible to scrub off, no matter how many times you tell yourself it doesn't matter. That Christmas morning, after seeing that godforsaken photo with my ghost replaced by a potted plant, I didn't yell, didn't drink myself into a numb state like I had the year before, didn't send angry messages or call anyone to demand an explanation. Instead, I did what I've always done. I let it fester in silence. I closed the laptop, poured another mug of coffee that I didn't really want, and sat on my couch staring at my undecorated walls, wondering how the hell it had come to this. How I, the same daughter who once helped string lights on Grandma's porch when nobody else wanted to stand in the cold, the same cousin who always bought the extra pie just in case someone brought a date, had become so disposable that my absence didn't even require a lie anymore. I thought about texting my mom. Just a simple, Merry Christmas, maybe with a question mark at the end like a trap I wasn't brave enough to admit I was setting. I hovered over the keyboard, typed a few variations, then deleted them all. What was the point? She wouldn't answer, or worse, she'd reply with some empty holiday greeting that pretended nothing had happened, and I didn't think I could stomach the artificial cheer. So instead, I scrolled. I opened old photos, digging back through 5, 10, even 15 years of digital clutter, scanning for proof that I'd ever been included in the first place. And I found them, pictures from birthday parties, Sunday brunches, 4th of July barbecues, and I started to notice something I hadn't let myself see before. In every image, I was just slightly out of place. Either in the back or off to the side, or blurred in motion like I hadn't stayed still long enough to matter. In the last few years, I was often completely missing, even in events I remembered attending. I remembered what I wore. I remembered holding someone's baby. I remembered refilling the punch bowl while everyone else took turns posing. But in the evidence they'd chosen to preserve, the photos they shared, printed and framed, I was a phantom. And that's when something in me snapped. Not in the theatrical way where you start throwing things or sobbing on the floor, but with a kind of stillness that felt more dangerous, more certain. It was like a circuit flipped, and I realized with sudden, blinding clarity that I didn't want to be back in their pictures anymore. I didn't want to fight my way into their narrative just to be tolerated. I wanted something else. I wanted to be undeniable. I wanted them to look out their window and see me larger than life. I wanted them to flinch, not because I'd screamed at them, but because I'd done something so audacious, so impossible to ignore, that they'd have no choice but to remember who they erased. Now, a normal person might have gone the route of a heartfelt letter, or maybe a dramatic voicemail, or even just a full-blown therapy session to unpack the abandonment, but I've never been good at tidy, appropriate solutions. I was angry, but more than that, I was done being subtle. And that's when I remembered something that had been buried in the back of my mind, a conversation from months earlier with my cousin Rachel's ex-husband, Troy, who worked for a regional Billboard company. At the time, we'd laughed about the absurdity of putting your face on a 10-foot poster, like only egomaniacs or lawyers did that, but he'd told me the company was family-run and that they sometimes gave discounts for local projects. So I dug through my texts, found his number, and sent a message before I could talk myself out of it. Hey Troy, random question. What would it cost to rent a billboard for a week across from someone's house? It took him about 10 minutes to reply, probably because he was with his own family, pretending not to hate everyone. His message was short, depends on location. Got one in mind? I typed back, the one on Millerton Road, right across from the corner house with the big pine tree in front. My grandma's. There was a pause. Then, I can check. You want it before New Year's? Christmas week, I replied. Soon as possible. You planning something petty or criminal? Petty, I wrote. But harmless. He sent back a laughing emoji, which I ignored, and then a price that wasn't cheap but wasn't impossible either. A few $100s for 1 week. More than I'd usually spend on a revenge fantasy, but at that moment, it felt like a bargain. By that evening, while the rest of the family was probably sipping hot cider and doing their gift exchange without me, I was sketching out ideas on a napkin at my kitchen counter. What should I put on it? My name? A quote? A passive-aggressive holiday greeting? I considered doing something tasteful, something quiet and emotional, but quickly tossed that idea aside. I wanted this to hit them in the teeth, not their hearts. I decided I'd do a full-on photo shoot. Something ridiculous. Something they'd never forget. I'd rent a Christmas sweater, do my hair up big like a pageant queen, hold a sign that said something like, "Miss me now" or "Family photo, take 2." I wanted it to be absurd, funny, humiliating, not for me, but for them. Because if I was going to be remembered as the black sheep, I'd make sure they never forgot how woolly I could be when provoked. So I booked a next-day studio session with a friend who owed me a favor, and I started planning my wardrobe like a bride preparing for a wedding she knew she'd walk into alone. The petty part of me felt powerful, like I was finally directing the narrative. For once, I wouldn't be erased or cropped out. I'd be billboard-sized and facing their window with a smile that said, "This is what happens when you treat someone like they don't belong." I wasn't doing it to start a fight. I wasn't doing it to win anyone back. I was doing it to take up space, to take back space. Because after a lifetime of being shoved into corners, I was done shrinking. And by the time that billboard went up, there wouldn't be a single soul in that house who could pretend I didn't exist. Not this time. There's a strange clarity that arrives when you finally let go of the fantasy that people will change, when you stop holding your breath for an apology that's never coming, when you finally understand that being right has nothing to do with being loved. And in that space, once the ache has dulled and your expectations have collapsed under their own weight, what remains is not grief, but a cold, clean fury that pushes you to reclaim something you didn't even know you'd lost. That was the feeling that carried me through the next 48 hours as I threw myself into the most elaborate, ridiculous, and liberating act of passive-aggressive rebellion I've ever orchestrated in my life. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to scream or burn bridges or make anyone cry, but I wanted something real, something visible, something so bold and unignorable that even their silence would sound like a confession. I booked the studio for early Monday morning, a dusty little place in the industrial part of town run by a guy named Frank who did wedding photos, graduation portraits, and the occasional pet calendar for bored retirees. Frank owed me a favor from years ago, long story involving his sister, a bounce check, and a very public screaming match at a flea market, and while we hadn't talked in a while, he didn't ask questions when I called. I told him I needed one shot, just one, but it had to look polished, loud, and over the top. He grunted something that sounded like agreement, and I packed a duffel bag with 3 outfits, a curling iron, 2 pairs of earrings, and a giant red Christmas bow I found buried in my junk drawer. By the time I walked into Frank's studio at 9 the next morning, I had slept maybe 4 hours, downed 2 cups of bitter gas station coffee, and spent the better part of the night rotating between maniacal laughter and existential dread. The adrenaline was wearing off, but the idea still held. This was how I would make myself unerasable. I would become the centerpiece, the unavoidable spectacle, the punchline they couldn't quite explain without admitting the joke was on them. Frank didn't blink when I pulled out the sequined green sweater with Ho Ho Holy *T written across the chest in gold thread. He didn't flinch when I teased my hair into something that looked like a cross between Dolly Parton and a Christmas tree. He just set up his light stands, told me to stand against the white backdrop, and asked, deadpan, "You want serious or crazy eyes?" I said, "Both. Make it look like I'm 1 martini away from emotional collapse, but festive." We took 30 shots in under 20 minutes. Some with a sign, some without. I ended up choosing one where I held the oversized red bow like a gift and smiled just a little too wide, that kind of expression you wear when you're pretending everything is fine, but secretly fantasizing about setting fire to your ex's wardrobe. Across the top of the image, I had Frank add the text, "Merry Christmas from the Family Disappointment." And underneath, in script font so syrupy it practically dripped, "Wish you were here." Once I had the file, I sent it directly to Troy, the Billboard guy, and asked him how soon we could get it printed and installed. To his credit, he didn't laugh. He didn't even ask questions. He just said, "I can make it happen by Thursday if you approve it today." I wired him the money within the hour and signed the release paperwork without reading half of it. I didn't care about fine print. I cared about placement, and he assured me that the location I'd chosen, Millerton Road, across from the corner house with the pine tree, was available. That was all I needed. Now, for context, Grandma's house sits on a small hill just past the town's old railway line. It's the kind of neighborhood that hasn't changed in 30 years. Chain-link fences, cracked sidewalks, porch flags fading in the sun, and yards with gnomes and lawn chairs that haven't been moved since the Bush administration. But there's one thing that had changed in the past few years: the development company that bought the strip of land along Millerton and installed 2 brand-new digital billboard panels, visible from every window on the east-facing side of Grandma's house. When I was a kid, that lot had nothing but weeds and broken beer bottles. Now it was a space for rotating ads, injury attorneys, 4th of July mattress sales, and political smear campaigns. But for 1 full week, beginning December 28th, that space would be mine. When the billboard went up, I wasn't there to see it in person. I truly did. I wanted to stand on the corner with a latte and sunglasses and watch their faces as they pulled into the driveway. But I knew that wasn't the point. The power wasn't in being present. It was in not being there. It was in letting them face the image on their own terms, without the opportunity to deflect, explain, or diminish it. The power was in the permanence. And sure enough, by noon that day, the texts started rolling in, not to me, of course, but to each other, in group chats I hadn't been part of in years. I only knew this because my cousin Jenna, who still played both sides of the fence, sent me screenshots. The group chat titled "Fam Bam Christmas" lit up with chaos. "Aunt Carla, is this real? Jake, she seriously put herself on a billboard?" My mother, dry as ever, she's clearly crying out for attention. And Jenna, sweet Jenna, who rarely took sides, but always watched from the margins, replied, "Well, maybe someone should have invited her." I stared at that message for a long time. It was simple, honest, quietly devastating. Then, around 4 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Grandma. Now, you have to understand, my grandmother is not the warm, fuzzy kind who bakes cookies and knits blankets. She's sharp, old school, raised 5 kids while working double shifts at the textile mill, and carries a kind of steely silence that can either comfort or terrify you, depending on which way the wind's blowing. She rarely calls me. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time she had. But there her name was on my screen, pulsing quietly. I answered, expecting anger, confusion, maybe a demand to take it down. Instead, there was only her voice, trembling just slightly. "Honey," she said. "I had no idea. I didn't know they'd left you out. I thought you were busy." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My throat caught, not because I felt vindicated, but because it finally landed. She hadn't been part of it. Or maybe she had, in the way silence always is, but she hadn't known the extent, hadn't seen the pattern. Maybe she'd looked at the photos like everyone else and just assumed I'd been late, or behind the camera, or somewhere else entirely. Maybe she thought it was my choice. And in that moment, I wasn't angry anymore. I was just tired. But I didn't let it show. "I wasn't busy," I said. "I was never invited." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "Well, you're invited now. Any day you want. You hear me?" And even though I knew it didn't fix anything, even though I knew she couldn't undo the years of quiet omission, I nodded. Not for her, but for me. Because even a small gesture, an open window, can mean the world when you've spent years staring at closed doors. The billboard stayed up for 7 days. I never told my mother I did it. I didn't have to. She saw it every morning when she went to visit Grandma, parked right in front of the giant pine tree, trying not to look up as my 10-foot grin stared her down. They'd cropped me out for years. But this time, I was the backdrop. There is a peculiar kind of silence that falls when people are caught in a truth they've spent years ignoring, and it isn't the kind that comes from shock or disbelief, nor is it the dramatic, stormy hush that follows a confrontation with slamming doors or shouted accusations. No, this silence is quieter, subtler, and somehow heavier, the kind that hovers in the background of text messages left on read, of voicemails unreturned, of glances exchanged behind backs as people fumble for ways to rewrite the past into something more flattering, more digestible, more forgivable. I knew this silence well, had lived in its shadow for longer than I cared to admit, but what made it different now, what made it almost delicious, was that, for the first time, they were the ones choking on it. The morning after the billboard went up, the town's Facebook mom group caught fire, not because anyone knew the full story, of course they didn't, but because it was a slow news week and nothing stirs the pot quite like public family drama dressed up in sequins and sarcasm. Someone posted a picture from across the street, captioned, "Anyone know what this is about? Seems personal." Within an hour, the comment section was crawling with speculation. A few people thought it was an advertisement for a one-woman show. Others guessed it was part of some edgy church outreach. But most of them, especially the locals who had known my family since the Reagan era, put it together almost immediately, and with a mixture of horror, fascination, and restrained glee, they realized it was exactly what it looked like, me, the black sheep. The daughter they always whispered about but rarely mentioned, plastered larger than life across from my grandmother's living room like a seasonal warning shot. I didn't respond to any of the comments. I didn't need to. My phone vibrated constantly for the next 48 hours, not with messages from the people who should have been reaching out, not my mother, not my brother, not the cousins who used to braid my hair at family reunions, but from acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years. High school classmates, old coworkers, even my ex-boyfriend's sister, all texting variations of, "Was that really you?" and "Honestly, good for you." At first, I tried to explain. Then I stopped. Let them think what they want. The truth wasn't in the photo, it was in the years leading up to it, in the hundreds of tiny moments when I was told, through action and inaction, that I didn't quite belong. But inside the family group chat, the same one I hadn't been in for almost 3 years, the mood was less amused. Thanks to Jenna, whose screen recordings became my own private docuseries, I watched as the facade cracked in real time. My brother Jake, always the peacekeeper until it no longer suited him, fired the opening salvo with a weak, "Does anyone know why Melissa would do this?" followed immediately by my Aunt Carla, ever the voice of melodramatic outrage, who wrote, "This is disgusting. How could she do this to her own grandmother?" Which, of course, was ironic, considering the billboard wasn't about Grandma at all. It was aimed at them, at their years of curated neglect, their weaponized indifference. and their ability to rewrite family history with one strategically framed photograph at a time. My mother didn't say anything in the chat for nearly a full day, which I knew meant one of two things. Either she was trying to figure out how to spin the situation into something that made her look noble and long-suffering, or she was too furious to speak without saying something irreparable. Either way, when her message finally did come through, it was as cold and precise as I expected. We are all dealing with a lot right now. This kind of public humiliation helps no one. If Melissa wanted to talk, she could have picked up the phone. But clearly, she'd rather make a scene. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just blame, polished to a shine and served with the kind of emotional distance that has defined every one of our conversations for the last 10 years. But what she didn't expect, what none of them expected, was that I wasn't the only one who'd noticed the pattern. That billboard, gaudy and ridiculous as it was, had done something I hadn't anticipated. It cracked open a door that had been locked for years. Jenna, always the quiet one, always watching from the sidelines, messaged me privately the next night. She said, "I know it probably doesn't mean much, but you weren't crazy. They left you out on purpose." They did the same to my sister when she came out. They make people invisible when it's easier than accepting them. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not victory. Not even satisfaction. Something closer to grief. Because there it was, not just confirmation, but shared pain, the quiet acknowledgement that what I'd endured wasn't unique. It was systemic. It was policy. And if they'd done it to me, they'd done it to others too. Over the next few days, more messages trickled in. A second cousin I barely knew wrote to say she remembered my mom making snide comments about me at a baby shower, calling me emotional and dramatic because I'd cried during a toast. Another cousin said she'd always wondered why I disappeared from the holiday photos when I used to bring the best desserts. Even Frank, the photographer, texted a blurry photo of the billboard from a passing car with the words, "You're famous now. Want to do Easter next?" But not all the messages were supportive. My brother finally reached out directly, and not to reconnect, but to reprimand. He called me selfish. Told me I'd embarrassed the entire family. Said I had no idea how hard I'd made things for Mom. He ended the message with, "I hope you're proud of yourself. You're not welcome here anymore." As if I had been welcome before. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't want back in. I didn't want a seat at their table if it came with strings and silence and a constant warning to shrink myself down into something they could tolerate. I didn't want their approval, their permission, or their curated version of love. What I wanted was already mine, my truth, my voice, and a 10-foot reminder that I existed, that I mattered, that I would no longer be cropped out without consequence. And yet, amid all the noise and fallout, something else happened, something I hadn't planned for, and something that hit me harder than any insult or backhanded apology. Grandma called again. This time, her voice wasn't trembling. It was clear. Steady. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." And what she said next changed everything. Not because it was shocking, but because it was the piece of the puzzle I didn't even know was missing. "You know, your mother, she's always been a little jealous of you. Ever since you were little. You were bright, you were brave, and you didn't put up with nonsense. You scared her, honey. You still do." I didn't say anything for a long time, because suddenly the whole narrative shifted in my mind. All the cold shoulders, the sarcastic barbs, the quiet omission, it wasn't about my failure to fit in. It was about her fear that I never needed to. And just like that, the billboard stopped feeling like revenge. It started to feel like a mirror. One she couldn't look away from. There are moments in life, quiet, almost imperceptible moments, that arrive not with fanfare or resolution, but with a kind of lingering weight, like the final note of a song that doesn't quite resolve, hanging in the air long after the music has stopped, leaving you unsure whether to clap or simply sit in silence and absorb what it meant. That's how it felt when the billboard came down, not with any grand finale or dramatic curtain call, but with a soft, almost anticlimactic return of normalcy, as if the town had collectively decided to pretend it had never happened. to tuck it away in the folds of small-town gossip where it would live forever as a half-remembered curiosity, whispered about at grocery store checkouts and barbershops, but never acknowledged in any real way by the people it was meant to confront. I didn't go to see it come down. I thought about it, of course. I imagined driving out there early in the morning with a thermos of coffee and watching the workers on their ladders peel back my face, frame by frame, until it was gone and the panel was empty again, waiting for the next ad about affordable dentures or roofing services. But I couldn't bring myself to go. Something about seeing it disappear felt too much like a funeral for a version of myself I'd finally put to rest, and I wasn't ready to say goodbye just yet, not to the version of me who finally stood her ground, not to the girl who, after years of being a footnote, made herself the headline, even if only for 7 days. Instead, I did what I always did when I needed to process something too big for words. I walked. I wandered the quiet back streets of my neighborhood, hands stuffed in my coat pockets, eyes on the sidewalk cracks, letting my mind unspool without agenda. It wasn't pride I felt. And it wasn't quite regret either. It was something heavier than both, something more complex, an odd mixture of relief, sadness, and a kind of restless uncertainty, like standing on the edge of a lake at dusk, unsure whether to dive in or turn back. The fallout had already begun to settle like dust. A few of the more distant relatives had called me brave. A few had called me unstable. Most had fallen back into silence, letting the days pass without comment, hoping perhaps that time would dull the edge of what I'd done and allow them to return to the comfortable version of the story where I was the problem, the fragile one, the one who overreacted and took things too personally. But I knew better now. I'd read the texts. I'd heard the tone in my brother's voice. I'd seen the panic in my mother's carefully worded responses. What I did wasn't a breakdown, it was a disruption. I had shattered the family mythology, and now they were fumbling for a way to patch the cracks without acknowledging the fault lines that had always been there. And yet, amid the noise, there was one voice that cut through, not because it was loud, but because it was honest. Grandma had called again 2 nights after her confession, her tone softer this time, like she'd been sitting with her own memories and finding them less comforting than she'd hoped. She asked if I wanted to come over for coffee. No pressure. No guilt. Just an open door. At first, I hesitated. I told myself it was a trap, that I'd walk in and find my mother sitting at the kitchen table with an apology rehearsed and weaponized, all sweet tone and sharp undertones. But something in Grandma's voice stopped me. There was no edge. Just weariness. So I went. The house looked exactly the same. The same brown shingle siding. The same wind chimes made from seashells she picked up in Myrtle Beach 20 years ago. The same porch swing that creaked like a tired joint every time the wind shifted. Nothing had changed on the outside. But as soon as I stepped in, I noticed the difference. She'd cleared a spot at the dining table. Not just cleared it, she'd made it mine. A coffee cup already waiting. A small plate of lemon bars, slightly overbaked like always, just how I liked them. And on the table, carefully spread out like something sacred, was a photo album I didn't recognize. Leather-bound, thick with years, its pages curling at the edges. "I've been meaning to show you this," she said quietly, almost apologetically, like she was offering me something fragile. "These are the ones they didn't want to keep. The ones I didn't throw away." I sat down slowly, unsure what I was about to see. And then I opened the album. And there I was. Not cropped. Not blurred. Not half in or half out of frame. Whole. My 8th birthday, frosting on my nose. Me in a Halloween costume with a crooked crown. My high school graduation, standing awkwardly next to my mother, who was smiling in the picture but had barely said 2 words to me that day. Dozens of moments I had forgotten. Moments I hadn't known were captured. Each one a small act of preservation. Proof that I had been there, that I had mattered, at least to someone. I don't know what I expected to feel. Gratitude? Sadness? Vindication? But what I felt, more than anything, was grief. Not just for the years I had spent chasing something hollow, but for the years they had spent pretending I was never really part of the picture to begin with. Grandma didn't say much after that. She just let me sit there, flipping page after page, until the sun shifted through the blinds and the lemon bars went soft on the plate. Eventually, she touched my hand and said, "You don't have to fight so hard to be seen anymore. I see you." It was the simplest thing, but it broke me open. And for the first time, I realized that maybe I hadn't put my face on that billboard just to prove a point to them. Maybe I'd done it for me. Maybe I needed to see myself in a way I never had before, bold, unapologetic, unmissable. But even with all that, the question still lingered, hovering like smoke. Was I the villain now? Had I gone too far? Had I let my hurt mutate into something cruel, something theatrical, something my mother could point to and say, "See? This is why we didn't include her." Because even if my pain was justified, even if their silence had been a knife pressed against my back for decades, I couldn't escape the fact that I'd retaliated in a way that left a scar. Not just on them, but on me. Being cropped out hurts. But being remembered only for your retaliation, for your most dramatic moment, for the billboard version of yourself, that carries a different weight altogether. I don't know if what I did was right. I don't know if it made things better. But I do know this. They'll never be able to say I wasn't there. They'll never be able to pretend I didn't count. Because when they sit around the fireplace next Christmas, smiling for another perfect photo, someone's going to glance out the window and remember the time the daughter they tried to forget stared back at them from 10 feet tall, unblinking and grinning and impossible to crop. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.